when I speak about this idea of masters and servants, it really goes back to just my own understanding of Latin American history. Although there's been human settlement in those areas that we think of as comprising Latin America, that would be Central and South America, as well as the Caribbean islands, for almost as long as there has been human settlement, Latin America can really be thought of as having been invented with the first widespread visits to the area by European explorers. That's not to say before European explorers there was no history, but there was no Latin American history. There was history of those areas. Latin America is a phenomenon that comes with the arrival of the Europeans, people like Christopher Columbus, of course, but also Pedro Alvarez Cabral, Henry Cabot, Amerigo Vespucci, and others. Latin America, by its very definition, implies the collision of European and Amerindian cultures, to which we must add, of course, the many African cultures that began to be brought to the region with the advent of chattel slavery in the late 16th century. It would be nice to imagine, as many in my own country would like, that this collision of cultures was pacific, was peaceful and tranquil and whatever, a persistent blending of cultures and ideas over the centuries. Sadly, we know that it was anything but that. The clash was often political and military with awful violence, and finally, the forced subjugation of the Amerindian and African populations to the fast arriving European colonizers. Thus, one could argue that Latin America brought with its very invention a structure of racial and ethnic hierarchy that sadly still permeates the region today. From the late 16th century through the early 19th century, non-Europeans were structurally considered subjects as opposed to citizens. They existed at the behest of the dominant European colonizers, and their forced labor was needed for work on plantations, in mines, or in domestic situations as various kinds of servants. This began to change by the end of the 18th century when the Haitian-born French military officer Toussaint Louverture led a successful slave revolt in Haiti that defeated Napoleon and established an independent Afro-Haitian republic. News of the successful Haitian revolt reverberated throughout the region. It was not accidental that as Latin American movements to declare independence from Spain surged in the 19th century, proposals to end or limit slavery or to grant indigenous communities full citizenship were integral parts of the platforms of the independence fighters. Indeed, Latin America was, for the most part, well ahead of the United States in terms of ending slavery. By 1830, only two Latin American nations, Brazil and Cuba, still allowed it. Few Americans realized that the so-called Mexican-American War, for example, between the US and Mexico, was actually fought to allow Texans the right to continue to use slaves, a practice that was forbidden by the Mexican Constitution. With the end of chattel slavery, the African and Amerindians who had worked on farms or mines gradually transformed into more typical peasant or proletarian classes with some peculiar distinctions. Yet one area of the former racial and cultural hierarchy remained intact: domestic servants. Even today, most middle-class families in much of Latin America employ at least one, at least part-time domestic worker, whether as a cook, for childcare, or general domestic duties. As the potential pool for this kind of labor is often several times the size of the middle class in a given area, employment of domestic labor can be seen as a kind of almost national duty, a way to give work and salaries to a part of the population, especially women in need. Although less frequently than years ago, often these domestic workers live in at least part of time in the family home, giving them an ambiguous role in the emotional life of the families for whom they work. It should come as no surprise that the vast majority of Latin American filmmakers come from the upper economic stratum. Until the rise of the digital age, few Latin Americans have had access to the equipment or especially the training to make motion pictures. Even those filmmakers, known for the radical nature of their social critiques, often came from extremely successful, prominent families. Many of them would have come from the kinds of families that would have employed a number of domestic servants, with at least some of whom they would have established powerful emotional relationships. A Brazilian filmmaker I know has been supporting the woman who largely raised her and her siblings while their mother pursued a successful career as a doctor, and such situations are extraordinarily common. Thus, it was a kind of natural development that around the turn of the century, a number of films began emerging from around Latin America that were at least partially meditations on the relations between domestic help and the families for whom they work. As filmmakers began increasingly to interpret the personal as the political, a new welcome emphasis on domestic life, as well as on gender relationships, spread throughout the work of the area's most interesting young filmmakers. Finally freed from having to tell their nation stories, they could finally offer close looks at the private worlds they knew best. A powerful early example of this is Lucrecia Martel's La Ciénaga, made in 2001. In my opinion, the most talented filmmaker working in Latin America today, Martel chose to make her debut feature a meditation on the world of her childhood and that of her family. The film is set in Salta, Martel's home province in the northwest of Argentina. Although Argentina is overwhelmingly considered a white country, with about 85% of the inhabitants said to be descendants of Europeans or Middle Easterners, Salta is different in that about 25% of its population is indigenous. Bumping up against the borders with Bolivia and Paraguay, two overwhelmingly indigenous countries, Salta features a racial tension that is far more submerged in the rest of Argentina, as there is more daily contact between white Argentines and the indigenous communities who were largely exterminated, and I use that word fully conscious of its dark meaning, in the 19th century. A powerful strain of traditional Argentine political thinking has been seeing the conflict as being a struggle no less than between civilization versus barbarism, as announced in the title of Domingo Sarmiento's famous essay. Barbarism can never truly be conquered. It must be continually fought as it constantly threatens to come back, crossing right over the border that is never too far away. Civilization, of course, is that which is represented by white Argentina, and La Ciénaga is especially good at showing the utter decadence of this class. The story centers around a family from Buenos Aires vacationing in their country house in Salta. Despite the outer trappings of prosperity and class, in fact, their situation is worsening. Their business hangs on a thread, their house is falling apart, and their swimming pool is grossly polluted, its filter having long stopped functioning. It's a status that's kept up only by appearances, the most important of which is having white skin. Next to them are the indigenous people. Most of the ones we meet are those who work for the family. Not much is told about them, and the fact that they all seem to speak perfect Spanish indicates that they are at least somewhat well integrated into the larger Argentine society. Let's look at the film's opening sequence.
Señor, gracias por la Misael, gracias por la Misael.
¿Con quién está Joaquín en el cerro? ¡Vamos, gringo!
Que no quiero estar más con nadie que con Isabel. La mamá la va a echar, mami. ¿Por qué? Porque la mamá dice que le desaparecen las sábanas y las toallas. Y la va a echar. Es mentira.
Toma. Trajiste que no se va. Algo fresquito, toma. Sí, se van ya. Mira esta mujer cómo está.
Levántate que va a llover.
Ya voy. Yo me levanto, estoy bien.
¡Mami! ¡La mecha se ha caído! Yo no quiero ver sangre. No quiero ver sangre, mami, ¿eh?
Yo me levanto sola.
Moraron la silla, mami.
Soltame, Isabel. Soltame, mami, no hagas escándalo. Salí, ya está, deja. ¡Ay! Ay. Ahora aparecen las toallas por todos lados, ¿no?
Mami, anda a traer el auto del jardín.
Déjame vos. ¡Parala! ¡Soltame, Isabel!
Vas a pagar muy caro por tus traiciones que haces en esta vida. Todo se va.
Llamarlo a todo gringo, decirle que van para allá. Tu mamá está perdiendo mucha sangre.
Mami, anda a buscar mi vestido de botones. Anda a buscarlo. Que esta india me quiere llevar hacia a la Ciénaga.
Hay que llevarla ya a un hospital porque está perdiendo mucha sangre.
Fíjate que se llevó Isabel.
Okay, let me see if that could give me just a second so I can get rid of this. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Everything back?
Yep.
Great, okay. I always label this the dinosaur sequence. The tight close-ups of the cellulite hips and paunchy stomachs gives the sense of the family and their friends as dying creatures, which in fact they are. Despite their barking of orders, they seem incapable of action. They need the help of their indigenous servants to do anything. Yet they blamed them in the middle of the crisis for the theft of towels, sheets, and dresses. It's an awful, empty performance of pro forma racial and class superiority. The indigenous people seem to tolerate it, perhaps knowing they can leave whenever they want. The relationship between the servants and their masters goes further in La Ciénaga to include a level of sexual tension, which of course has always been part of the equation. Here, Isabel, the young domestic, the young woman, native woman we see in the film, is clearly the object of sexual desire, if an unarticulated sexual desire, of the young woman called Momi. While not denying the erotic aspect of the closeness that Momi feels with Isabel, her emotional dependence here almost seems more like a substitute for the lack of close family ties. There is also another erotic strain between the masters and servants here, and that is the interest, which we don't see in this sequence, in which the eldest son, Jose, shows in Isabel, an interest that is rewarded with Jose's being beaten up by Perro, Isabel's erstwhile indigenous boyfriend. The scene of the dance, the site where the fight between Perro and Jose takes place, is interesting for the way it shows a strong indigenous community that seems proudly independent from the white kids who have invaded the dance. In La Ciénaga, the master-servant or slave relationship returns to its original racialized framework in a country that has long imagined itself as beyond race, that is, as white. The original sin of the Americas that continues to warp contemporary social and personal relationships. Another powerful example of the relationship between masters and servants in contemporary Latin America is the 2012 Brazilian film Neighboring Sounds, O Som ao Redor in Portuguese, the debut feature of the former critic Kleber Mendonça Filho. Kleber, Brazilians often use first names to distinguish people, as so many of them have the same last names, in a sense, reverses the focus of La Ciénaga. In that film, Lucrecia Martel begins with a sharp, intense focus on a single family and builds out to a larger portrait of a nation. Kleber, on the other hand, starts with a general thesis about the social structure of Brazil and then zooms in to see how that thesis operates on an everyday level in contemporary Brazil. The text of Neighboring Sounds, the work that informs almost every aspect of the film, is the famous study called in English the masters and the slaves. In Portuguese, the title is Casa-Grande e Senzala, which translates to the big house and the slave quarters. Its author, Gilberto Freire, was a student of the groundbreaking anthropologist Franz Boas at Columbia University. Freire's thesis was that all of Brazilian society was structured around spatial controls established during slavery. Brazil actually allowed slavery until 1888. Only Cuba continued slavery longer, till 1895. The big house was the symbol of the white-controlled world and institutions into which slaves could enter only under the most restricted of circumstances, such as when they worked as domestics. The slave quarters are those places where the slaves were free to live, although they could be penetrated pretty much at the will of their masters. These two geographical areas were clear and obvious during the era of plantation slavery. Kleber's great innovation is to see how this ideology of big house and slave quarters has been reconfigured to modern Brazil. Neighboring Sounds is set in one of the many gated communities that form 4 to 5 enclaves in cities around Brazil. The community actually lives in the city, but through extra private security and impressive fencing, they attempt to keep out everyone else. Yet the impressive security is but a symbol of the fear that none of this will be enough. At any moment, someone from the outside, someone who is not authorized to enter the big house, can break through. And the film offers several examples of the danger of these invasions. Kleber began his film with a series of period photographs of rural Pernambuco, the Brazilian state in which the film is set. Pernambuco has often been thought of as the birthplace of Brazil. It was the first part of Brazil to be seriously colonized, and its capital, Recife, that's written with a capital R, is in fact where Kleber lives and also sets his film. Indeed, the actual gated community in which the film is set is actually just down the street from the gated community in which Kleber and his family have lived for years. Neighboring Sounds is more directly concerned with relations between masters and servants than La Ciénaga, and thus offered a more nuanced portrait. First of all, Brazil has a much more complex racial history than Argentina, where the basic distinction was between white and non-white. Brazil has had active miscegenation since the 16th century, and thus dozens of generations of racial mixing among Europeans, Africans, and indigenous people. Excuse me, so much so that in many cases, it is simply impossible to define someone's race. At the top of Neighboring Sounds is, of course, the white elite, a family that is shown as having deep ties to rural Brazil that have now been transferred to forms of social control in the city. The old man, known variously as grandfather and coronel, the traditional honorific for a landowner, as well as his grandson João and assorted other family members. Their immunity to the law is well exemplified when we see another grandson, Dinho, dressing down the compound security team because they've investigated his car radio stealing business. Their power seems to know no boundaries. We see the grandfather head to the beach for a midnight swim. Recife, the city where the film takes place, is one of about 5 places on Earth where sharks go to mate. Swimming is strictly forbidden in any of the city's beaches, not to mention often fatal. And almost every year there are 1 or 2 tourists who, defy this and wind up having a great white, attacking them. In La Ciénaga, the distinction between servants and masters is hard and fast along racial lines. In Neighboring Sounds, the racial distinctions are more subtle. I'd like to screen a sequence now from the film which features 2 characters, both of whom in Brazil would be defined as caboclos, mixed race people with white, Amerindian, and African features. Both have a slightly elevated status. He is the head of the security crew. She is a housemaid with direct daily contact with her employers. Yet both know their places, or what their places are supposed to be. In this sequence, we will see how both surreptitiously enter an apartment within the compound whose owners seem away, as if they're pretending to move into the master class. Word of warning, it's a very sexy sequence. I don't want to offend anyone's sensibilities, but we are talking Brazilian cinema. So, you know, sexuality and sensuality are prime aspects of that cinema. So, it's going to just take a second for me to get.
I'm sorry, is the screen just frozen on my computer, or is it showing up okay on everyone else's screen, or?
I can't see Richard's screen right now. No, I can see.
Is it okay now, or I was frozen just for
give me a second. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just need to.
Okay, sure.
Get this up there.
Yeah, I think it's working now.
I hope so. Let me just make sure. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
Qual chefinha?
Ó, seu Valdomiro da 52 tá viajando e deixou a chave da casa para aguar as plantas. Bora lá?
Posso entrar na casa dos outros, não? Vamos.
curiosa.
Eu quero ver.
Porra,
Bora lá ver.
não quero tocar em nada não, velho.
Eu quero ir pra cama. Então.
Tá menstruada?
Tô não.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. In the first part of this sequence, we see the gradual invasion of space. Elements from the slave quarters make their way into the big house. Yet at the moment that they've taken over the master bedroom, there's just an extraordinary shock cut. A young Black man wearing only a white towel quickly passes in front of the door. No context is given for this, nor are there any consequences. This Black actor is never seen again. Was he really even there? Or is he a projection of the two characters on the bed, imagining themselves within racist terms as the lowest of the low, a young Black man? His presence is clearly an invasion and reflects back on the space invasion that the couple itself is currently engaged in. We then cut to a sequence of a young girl who lived with her family. She's a character we've seen earlier in the film, in the compound, who dreams that the compound is being invaded by inhabitants of the slum next door. And that's, again, something you find in Brazil. Beautiful, magnificent kind of urban, gated communities right next door to a huge slum. I mean, it's something you see in almost every Brazilian city. They climb over the fence and within moments are sitting in her living room. The sequence represents a world without boundaries, in which the separation between the big house and slave quarters has been irrevocably crossed. I think that's about all I have time for, because I said we'd spend about an hour, and I certainly want to leave some time for questions. I also mentioned, or Derek mentioned, perhaps I could bring in Roma, which didn't really have a chance to. Roma seems to me in many ways a much more typical kind of reenactment of the relationship between a family and its domestic health. The one great difference is normally you would think the family is involved in politics and it's the servants who are more concerned with personal life. And Roma reverses that formula. It's actually Cleo, the servant, who is involved in politics through her boyfriend, who becomes a member of a right-wing hit squad, or is a member of a right-wing hit squad, and the family that's very concerned with the breakup, the seeming impending divorce of the parents and things like that. So it kind of reverses that formula a little bit. But in many ways, I think these other two films represent a much more perhaps serious reflection on that question of masters and slaves in a contemporary Latin American context. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have or to comment on anything that I brought up in my talk.
So first of all, thanks, Richard, for that really interesting and insightful talk on those two films. I actually have a couple of questions in mind, but
Sure.
Maybe I'll just open the floor up just to make sure we don't have any questions from the students first.
I
and
see we have a couple of chats. Okay, yeah,
we can open. Yeah, and also feel free if you're shy, you can type your question in the chat box, and
sure, absolutely,
and I'll read it, or Richard can read it there.
Yeah.
Takes them a little bit of time to just kind of muster the courage sometimes.
No, believe me, I know. Maybe you want to start, Derek, to break
Sure.
the ice.
I guess the first question, I mean, not to give away any spoilers with the film, but I guess in the case of Neighboring Sounds, there is this kind of, there's stuff that happened in the past, I guess, and history kind of plays a certain role in the film. And even when you were talking about La Ciénaga, this sense of these aristocrats being somehow sort of frozen in time a little bit. And I was wondering what you think about the role of history and a certain kind of repressed past that maybe needs to be addressed, whether it's in the distant past or maybe even more a more recent historical past. Because I was thinking of Lucrecia Martel's The Headless Woman too, and how a lot of people relate that film to sort of Argentina's more recent history. And so I guess maybe just broadly about the role of history and a certain kind of addressing a repressed past and how you see that fitting into these master slave or master servant narratives. Or
I think, one of the questions you have in a lot of Latin American, not just film, but literature and whatever, is the idea of how does history move? Very often, say in the United States, we like to think history moves ahead, but in Latin America, there's not a lot of proof of that. In fact, history seems to be much more circular. Even La Ciénaga ends with a scene that's very reminiscent of that opening scene. So it gives you the sense that these are characters that are really trapped in a cycle, that history is not going anywhere, that in fact, they're just going to repeat themselves again and again. Even the end of Neighboring Sounds, in a way, which, evokes a certain kind of Brazilian myth of the person who comes, from the rural, countryside, whatever, and, in an act of vengeance, against the people who harmed his family and things like that. Even that seems like he's bringing up something from the past in order to, have to solve something in the future. Not totally sure that it ends as well, works as well as the ending does in La Ciénaga. But that's, I think, the big question for Latin Americans. Is history changing? Some Latin Americans will say, no, we've turned a corner, now Latin America is, Brazil is the country of the future. It's part of BRICS and all. But is it really? I mean, it seems to me, if you look at, the economic history of the last 20 years, Brazil has never gotten out of this kind of boom and bust cycle that has defined Brazilian history since the 17th century. They seem to have very little control over their fate. They always are responding to things that are going on outside of their borders. So that, I think, is always a big kind of question in Latin America. Are we still just a newer version of the old colonies, or have we actually broken? Are we something else now? And I think, very often in Latin American cinema, with its emphasis on circular narratives, the implication has always been we haven't gone anywhere, that we're really the same place.
That's really interesting, because actually during the COVID pandemic, I was making an attempt to read Nostromo, Joseph Conrad's novel, and I guess so much of that, what critics make of its narrative is that it has this kind of like circular and not exactly kind of linear or progressive trajectory, in that it somehow, takes a step forward and 2 steps backwards, and in some ways it mirrors that kind of circularity that you were mentioning, or this kind of difficulty of finding a sense of just a kind of straightforward progress, or vision of history as that sort of linear progress. Or do we have any questions from students, maybe following up on that, or some other? Tattoo has a question, I notice, I think.
I don't think a question, but a comment. I think Neighboring Sounds really strongly draws from history. I mean, remember, Derek, when we were watching it, and you noted that the soundtrack from the beginning, when there's those old archival footage of the haciendas and the slave farms, the music is from La Hora de los Hornos. So Kleber cites this older third cinema narrative via the audio, but also the narrative itself often, just they say the montage of the old shots in the beginning and in many other ways in the film refers to history. Say, like the black kid in the house you showed us in the clip could be because it's kind of return of the repressed of Brazilian slavery. Also, in one scene, the kind of it could be seen that the history literally bleeds into the present, where they're in the waterfall and suddenly the blood, and it's in the hinterlands where the sugar and anhinhos used to be. So, and also, of course, the narrative itself is in the end about revenge on the Padrão, on the Coronel Francisco. So I think history is very smartly brought very foregroundedly into the narrative by the filmmakers.
Oh, actually, I have a follow-up question to that, since you mentioned the blood and the revenge as well too. And I was wondering, because we talk in the rest of the symposium about some of these other films in terms of how they relate to a certain sense of a crisis or contemporary crisis in terms of inequality, especially since the 07 and 08 financial crisis. And a lot of times this sense of crisis manifests itself in a certain vision of violence or kind of eruption of violence in the narrative. And I was wondering, Richard, if you could think of some examples of these Latin American master slave or master servant narratives where this kind of either there's a sense of a kind of crisis that precipitates or some kind of eruption of violence that kind of represents maybe this kind of I don't know, return of the repressed or.
Well, I think both films actually are full of constant intimations of violence, and again, it has to do with the social structure of Latin America. In the United States, for example, I think people imagine that the shape of society is like an egg. We have very wealthy people at the top, and then it sort of broadens out as we get less wealthy, a big middle class. And then as we get down towards the worst forms of poverty, it again goes in. So it's ovular shaped or egg shaped. In Latin America, it's a pyramid or a triangle. You have very, very wealthy people at the top. And by the time you get to the bottom, it's the vast majority of the population. So that's very, very different. So the constant threat that these people are simply going to invade. What's stopping those people living next door to that gated community from just simply hopping the fence and taking over? I mean, people live with that fear, that very palpable fear that someday this is just going to happen. People will just say, I've had it, jump over the fence and try and take what they think should be theirs. You get a lot of intimations of violence also in La Ciénaga. Those of you who haven't seen the film, there are all these kind of moments where you think someone's going to get hurt. And then when somebody does actually get hurt, it's a completely absurd moment. It's a silly accident that can happen to anyone, anytime. But all the other moments are there just to create this constant sense that there's danger present in a way. But especially in places like Brazil or whatever, where, often during colonial periods, literally the ratio of masters to slaves was, 1 to 1,000, where you had, 150, white people who were in charge of thousands of slaves. And yet, there were, they managed to sort of continue that way. Now, of course, there were also slave revolts and things like that. That certainly was part of it. But that sense of impending danger that someday these folks are simply going to say we've had enough and jump over the fence, like we see in that dream of the young girl, is something that's very palpable, I think, in Latin American societies.
Mm-hmm. So I noticed there's a really interesting question from one of the students. Should I read it out or Richard?
Oh, sure. Why not?
Okay. So this is from Mia, who asked, "Dear Professor, I can see this master-servant relationship in another Latin American film, Arendura, by Roy Guerrera, and
it's actually based on a Garcia Marquez story.
Although in an implicit way, can I say Arendura and her grandmother's relationship can also be seen as a master-servant relationship? And does that indicate something in a bigger picture in Latin America? And does magic realism help to intensify maybe the tension or effect of this relationship?
It's been a while since I've seen the film. I wouldn't really put it in the same category. I mean, it seems to me more a generational thing than it is really, I think, a master-slave thing. And, that's a film where I felt that the attempts at magical realism were rather unsuccessful. It comes across like special effects as opposed to something more intrinsic to the story. But, I think the idea of master slaves is something you can trace in Garcia Marquez's work, that's for sure. I mean, certainly there are a number of his films, or his stories, I should say, that deal very specifically with that kind of relationship. His short story Leaf Storm, even passages of 100 Years of Solitude, certainly the relationship between the Buendias and their servants is something that really is spelled out pretty clearly.
Oh, and I also had a question, maybe following up from the clip that you showed from Neighboring Sounds. just in terms of, oh, and I suppose it relates to La Ciénaga as well, but the role of kind of sexuality, or in terms of these master-servant relationships, because actually I thought maybe one film could form part of the triangle of your presentation today was the Carlos Reygadas's Battle in Heaven, or but I mean, I guess Reygadas's films too, I mean, there's such a strong element of sexuality in them, but and I think maybe a point of connection I thought maybe you can comment on would be like the role of religion in Lucrecia Martel or Carlos Reygadas' film, because in La Ciénaga I remember there's all this stuff about the Virgin Mary, like
an apparition,
an apparition that's interspersed. So I was wondering if maybe you can say a little bit more about the role of religion and also sexuality in some of these films.
Well, I think, sexuality in La Ciénaga is, I think obviously an important theme. The house just feels like this kind of festering, mold of all kinds of, sexual intentions.
A lot of skin in the movie.
A lot of skin in the movie, but, you have the father who's pretty much left the mother, had a relationship with this woman who is now having a relationship with the son. You have the character of Momi, who seems clearly in love in some kind of physical way with one of the servants. You have Jose, the son, who seems to want to have some kind of typical master-servant sexual relationship. So that it's a house that's just, oozing sexuality, and feels it. And also the way these people are always jumping into each other's beds, or, touching each other. It's odd, I think, for many viewers. Now, again, I think there are cultural things. I think Latin Americans are much freer physically than, certainly Americans are, and stuff like that. But there is this kind of hothouse quality to La Ciénaga, where you really feel that the whole thing feels like, a Tennessee Williams fever dream or something like that, with, sexuality lurking around every corner. The sexuality, I think, in Kleber's film it's not exactly subdued. I mean, you have that great sequence, with the two going off into that other apartment to have sex and whatever. So there's always that around it, one could say, but a little less of a theme, perhaps, than it is in La Ciénaga, where some of that is a certain autobiographical aspect. This is Lucrecia's family, but it's a family of people she knows. This is the world she came from. And so she knows these people. And I think, many people have identified the character of Momi with Lucrecia, the director, who is openly out and always has been, as long as I've known her. I've known her for more than 20 years. She's always been out in her sexuality as a lesbian. And I think that she's thinking about, being a young lesbian, having these feelings and not being able to articulate them, excuse me.
And maybe the link between kind of the sexuality or the kind of religious aspects, or I was just thinking like in Battle in Heaven too, because I remember there's that ending where they're kind of these penitents who are just kind of like marching on their knees and so on.
Again, I think, religion provides an answer when there isn't one. If you really want in a certain way to understand what's going on and you can't, there's no logical framework you can accept, you turn to religion, and religion then provides the answer you want. The Virgin told me, and that gives you what you need to know, or if I just flagellate myself, things will get better. They're irrational responses to a world in which reason doesn't seem to function.
Oh, and I noticed an elaboration from the student earlier asking about Arendira. And she says that she hasn't seen La Ciénaga, but from the clip, it seems to have a lot of dreamlike components, as well as kind of, I guess, an oniric quality, like in Neighboring Sounds as well. And so she's thinking if you can maybe comment a little bit on these kinds of dreamlike aspects of the two films there.
Again, I think
actually it's my question. I just want to elaborate a little bit, because
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
all of
yeah, yeah.
these
Oh,
you
sorry. Yeah,
showed,
that's yours. Yes.
all of these scenes you show have beds, and having seen the films, they're really on Eric Dream, like, you know, you start to question, is this real, or is this really happening in the film? And there's also, I haven't seen La Ciénaga, but from the clip you showed, it seems to have a lot of substance abuse. So and also drugs like sex plays this illicit role in Neighboring Sounds. So, and also other films of this sort, like The Tenants from Brazil by Sergio Bianchi, which I wrote about in conjunction with Neighboring Sounds. I was wondering what you make of these dreamlike components of these films.
Yeah, it comes down almost to a question of vocabulary. The Argentine critic David Ubiña coins a phrase which I find useful, which is mellow realism, which is a combination of kind of melodrama and realism, in the sense that both are films that are very, solidly based in kind of very concrete situations. But at the same time, they have this melodramatic stylization. So I think that, to me, works better. An Eric Dreamlike, those are a little bit vacuum words. I mean, anything you want to put into them, you can. So I think that, Ubiña's insight that what these films are, they're kind of almost, postmodern melodramas. They're a way in which they take aspects of what had been melodrama and kind of shift them somewhat on their head, especially in terms of the use of the house. The house no longer a haven, but actually kind of what imprisons people. That's especially strong in La Ciénaga, where the house is no longer a haven in a heartless world. It is the heartless world. In fact, you escape the house in order to get away from that.
Thanks.
Sure.
And I guess a question, maybe just kind of relating this topic to the history of Latin American cinema. Well, I mean, when we teach it here, just because we don't have a dedicated course, let's say, on Latin American cinema, but of course we would introduce students to the more radical phase of let's say Cinema Novo, or we talk about third cinema, and we talk about the history of the coups at the time, and how we had kind of cinema almost as this underground form of expression. And then we can sort of jump to the last kind of 20 years of this kind of like Renaissance in Latin American cinema. But I was wondering, in terms of just periodizing like different phases in terms of the development of Latin American cinema, do you see any like very significant changes in how the sort of master slave or the master servant dynamic was kind of treated in different phases in the development of, let's say, from today to a kind of more radical period of Latin American cinema? Or
I think if you look at Latin American film history from, say, 1960 till about 1995 or thereabout, you can sometimes call that the period of the national cinemas, in that the Cuban Revolution and the founding of ICAIC, the Cuban Film Institute, created a kind of model for, maybe this is what we should do. We should nationalize our cinema. This is the way of taking care of Hollywood, making sure that we have continuous production, all those kinds of things. So throughout the 60s and 70s, you have a series of experiments.
Oh, sorry, Richard, I think the your screen froze there. Is it just my computer, or? Oh, hi, Richard. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I think the audio and video on your end froze there. Oh, I think you're back.
Yeah, I am back. I sort of stopped me in the middle.
Sorry.
Anyway, what I'm just saying, that from about 1960 till about the mid 1990s, it was the era of kind of national cinemas, where there was tremendous movement on trying to get governments involved in organizing national cinema, both on the production level, sometimes on the distribution, exhibition level, whatever. I think there was a tendency at that time, because filmmakers were working for the government, not really working for the government, using the government to make films that were national epics, that were about Brazil, that were about Argentina. There was this kind of almost duty to sort of offer the bigger picture. I think once we start getting into the 90s and that era stops because governments are no longer that interested in financing films, and B, there's just a change in the notion of politics and things like that. The personal becomes the political. You begin to have people looking much more closely at their own worlds, their own lives, in a sense. And with that came, I believe, this interest in trying to make films which at least attempted to see what the relationship was between, the children and the middle-class families and their servants. Some of this was autobiographical, filmmakers looking back on their lives. From Colombia, we have our own Felipe Barbosa, a very talented Brazilian filmmaker who actually made a film called Casa-Grande, Big House, which is about a middle-class family whose father has made bad investments and the family's going bankrupt. And, the last thing they get rid of are their servants. But the young man is much closer to the servants than he is to his parents. So he kind of seeks them out. He goes to live with them at one point and stuff. So, another very interesting film in this particular movement. So again, I think that the master-servant story has come out much more strongly lately, because I think there's been much more towards a turn towards personal storytelling. And what I mean by that is story that in many ways are very close to the filmmakers, as opposed to national epics, where something like that might come in, but it's less of a kind of driving force behind those films.
Yeah, actually, I mean, when you were showing the clips from La Ciénaga today, it did strike me that it's sort of like, the way she deals with the relationship between Momi and the maid. It's there is this very personal, kind of like intimate quality that it could be something out of a memoir or something. Because when I think back to the 60s and I think of a movie like maybe from Cuba, like Memories of Underdevelopment, like the relationship between that intellectual and the maid, that he sort of gets pregnant and then her brother comes and beats him up, but it has much more of that kind of political satire, maybe at a national level, as you were saying, compared to the kind of more private or personal stories that we see in Latin cinema, American cinema today.
Yeah, that would be my thesis. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions, on both sides of it. But I think generally those are the tendencies that, again, especially in Cuba, where, you're making Cuban films for Cuba. You're not making it. Now, that doesn't mean these films aren't great works of personal expression, but that wasn't what you were supposed to be doing, really. You were supposed to be making Cuban films about Cuba. And so because of that, the emphasis was on the national picture as opposed to the personal one.
Was the sort of master servant or master slave dynamic much of a thing at all in sort of like studio genre films, like let's say prior to these various art film movements and so on? Or
I think, again, in Brazil, there was always a certain tendency, because also it was a way of including Blacks in films, and to often use Black actors as butlers, servants, whatever. And this was a way of making an excuse for them to be in the big house, and then, they could sing and dance and, be funny and stuff like that. So I think there was less of a kind of emphasis on that. But occasionally you would have it. And as I said, especially with African-American actors, it would be a way that they could enter into, into the mainline narratives, but as servants, as assistants, as something like that, never as full-blown characters on their own.
Right. Any other questions from our students, or maybe? Yeah, please feel free to type in the chat box too. And are there any other kind of very striking differences for you, Richard, when you look at these films from that deal with the sort of master servant narrative in Latin America as opposed to the rest of the world, given that somehow these narratives, I guess, have become a bit more popular during this kind of crisis period in the past decade? But do
Well,
you
I
see
think,
any
again,
striking differences? Or
yeah, I think, Latin America is somewhat, unique in this kind of way that it was created. I mean, you could say there's some, could we compare it to the United States? Well, the United States, exterminated its indigenous people and, has done its best to keep its African-American population in check, throughout all these years. In Latin America, first of all, the numbers were just so much greater, of all the slaves that were imported, enslaved people, I should say, from Africa to the New World, only 4% came to the United States. The rest came to Latin America. So the numbers were much, much bigger, and so because of that, you have these huge populations of people who are, in a certain way, underclass, if we want to use that word. So I think it's created a very special kind of society. I mean, it's hard to think of anywhere else on earth where you have this kind of created society where it's created along racial and ethnic lines that, lead to certain kinds of class structures. I don't know of anywhere else that has that where that's happened.
And I guess the language becomes an important dimension in these films as well. I mean, because I'm thinking of Roma, Alfonso Cuarón made a big deal of sort of like subtitling the text in with a different font, I think, or different color. Yeah. And are those kind of the use of dialects and so on, or languages also quite distinct in La Ciénaga, or
Well, I don't think there's a moment in La Ciénaga where you hear any indigenous language. I can't remember any. In something like Mexico, it's a kind of interesting question because there are hundreds or dozens, at least probably hundreds of different indigenous languages spoken, and the government has in recent times done something to try and continue its instruction, also just its preservation. In terms of recording it, creating dictionaries, things like that. But, there are large parts of Mexico where, obviously younger people generally will speak some Spanish, but older people won't necessarily. And I've actually met younger people who don't really speak Spanish. They speak whatever their indigenous language is. Now, those are people who live in those communities that are, generally leave those communities to live in kind of, regular Mexican society, but they are there, and I think it's become an issue. I mean, one of the things Cuarón wanted to, I think, show is the fact that people like this, when they move, don't lose their roots. They continue to speak their language, associate with their fellow ethnics and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions, or
okay, anything in the doc? All right.
Yeah, anything? And in terms of, I guess, geography, like given that the two films that you spoke of today, like La Ciénaga, I guess you mentioned it takes place in Salta, and neighboring towns in Recife. And I guess neither are very central locations, or kind of like they're far from like the nation's capital, or are they considered kind of like fairly peripheral places, or
Well, I mean, Salta certainly is. I mean, because Salta is so unlike the rest of Argentina, having a very strong indigenous presence and things like that. It's really quite far in that way. Pernambuco, I mean, again, has a long and important history in terms of Brazil, especially early Brazil. But the thing about Brazil is it's an enormously regional country and always has been. There's no center in Brazil. I mean, you know, Sao Paulo has 18 million people, is far and away the economic capital, certain ways the cultural capital, you know, at least disputedly, but very few people would see Sao Paulo as the center of Brazil. It's too distinct, it's too unique, it's too unlike the rest of Brazil. You know, same with Rio. Every place has their, you know, it's really almost a bunch of little countries, you know, more than, or mid-sized countries than it is really one country. And it's always been very regional in its identities, even in its cinema. I mean, this area of Pernambuco, which is where Kleber's from, probably in the last 20 years has been arguably the most interesting part of Brazil in terms of filmmaking, you know. And of course, now with digital technology, you no longer need the cities. You no longer need laboratories. You no longer need funding from the cities. You know, so because of that, a tendency that's been with Brazilian cinema since the beginning towards a certain kind of regionalism just continues, you know, because in fact you have a lot of sort of local centers of production, you know, springing up with little or no need to sort of link them to the capitals.
I would maybe add to the regional thing about, obviously, it's northeastern Brazil. The Nordeste has legendarily been a really poor area where, for example, many of the early Cinema Novo films have been set, and many of the folks during the famines there and the dry seasons were the people who came out to the big cities like Rio, Sao Paulo, in the south and created the favelas, the unintended city. So perhaps a film about poverty and inequality coming out of Recife has more like street credibility than another one from the more economically better off places in Brazil.
Although, I mean, you know, there's a sense in which, you know, neighboring sounds could take place in Rio or Sao Paulo. I mean, you have the same kind of gated communities. Yeah, and it is, I mean, also a little bit different. Pernambuco is, you know, it's not the sertão, you know, it's not that dry, arid area. It's, you know, much more tropical, you know, it's, so again, it's another Brazil, you know, when you go there. When I first went to Pernambuco a few times, I was really struck by the native influence, the Amerindian influence, huge Amerindian population there, and you know, almost eclipsing that of, say, the Afro-Brazilian population, where if you go south to Bahia, it's a completely African city. So again, Brazil is an enormously varied place, as you know, from having been there, and everywhere you go, that it's its own little space. Very little sense of what it means to be Brazilian. You know, I think that's always been a very regional, you know, regional country.
And maybe to wrap things up, have you noticed any maybe changes or differences or new signs in terms of how these master servant narratives have been dealt with in kind of very recent Latin American films, maybe just in recent years? And also, do you have any other films that you recommend to our students besides the two that you spoke of so eloquently today?
I also, thank you. I also mentioned the film by Felipe Barbosa, who's, you know, a colleague of yours from Columbia University. He's a Brazilian filmmaker. He's made a couple of feature films so far and some very good shorts. His first feature film is called Casa-Grande, which just means big house. And again, you can see the influence of that philosopher or that writer, Gilberto Freire, on many of these people. And again, it's about a young man who literally moves in with some of his servants because in a way he feels more at home with them than he does with his own family. There's a, what's it called? It's an Argentine film that came out early 2000s. It's called La Cama Dentro, which means basically when you say cama dentro, usually is when you're advertising for a servant means that you can live in, you know, and it's about this old woman who's being cared for by another woman who's worked with her for many years. And the woman who is the servant gets sick. And essentially they change roles, you know, essentially the woman who is, you know, the mistress or whatever has to take care of her servant. And it's an interesting role reversal in the way that happens. There's a Chilean film called La Nana, which is, again, another one about servants. So, I mean, as I said, as you go through Latin America, it's really impressive how often the theme of the relationship between masters and servants in the last 20 years has been a theme that we've seen in many films.
Wow. So very last chance for any questions from the students. So I guess we have 2 or 3 minutes remaining. Yes,
I would like
please.
to say something. Hello. Actually, what you mentioned previously, just like you said, the master and servant relationship, you said their role will be reversed when they were sick. Someone sick, their role will be changed. And I also would like to recommend one movie. Also, I just searched online. Actually, it's called A Simple Life, made in Hong Kong. And then actually it's talk about a warm relationship between a servant and master. So it's not just about violence in this kind of relationship.
Yes, actually, it's funny. I was mentioning that to Richard when we were doing our sort of, I guess, lecture kind of chat. Anne Hoy, this is Anne Hoy's film, A Simple Life, where
yes,
Andy Lau plays this, I guess, middle-aged man who comes to take care of the family servant who's become kind of elderly. It's quite a nice film.
Yeah.
So thank you,
yeah, no,
Mei Hua, for bringing that up.
I'm sure China has their films. I mean, the difference is that, I think in Latin America, you always have to think of the racial ethnic difference because that's really important. You're just really going to see in film after film that somehow that racial difference comes through, either in the case of Argentina, where it is really binary, white, non-white, or in Brazil, where it's much more muted because you have this huge set of racial categorizations. I mean, Brazil is just not black or white. There are blacks, there are whites, but there's so many people in between who don't consider themselves either. So you have to play with that. I'm not sure how that would work in China. There might be regional differences or things like that, but I don't think they would have the same force that these ethnic and racial differences have in Latin America.
Right. So that's a very important point to sort of like keep in mind, is that kind of the history of it, and also that kind of ethnic division. And I think all of us who have been here today have been very lucky in having a really great and really kind of insightful talk on these films from Latin America by Richard. And I think Richard will actually be he's joining us from Paris today, but he'll actually be in our part of the world, I think, sometime next year.
Yes, in the spring.
In the spring, because Richard will be teaching at Tsinghua University for a semester as a kind of visiting professor, and hopefully he'll be able to join us when he visits Hong Kong at some point as well. And we'd love to have some interactions between him and our students. And I think, as we saw today, I think all of us would benefit greatly from that. So thank you again, Richard, for that wonderful talk.
Thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I hope it's been of interest, and please, let's keep in touch.
Yes, I hope we can steal you again for our program at some point.
With pleasure. Okay. Bye all.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.